good evening, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be reading this book about the Aztec Empire. So let's just dive right in. But I do want to say that if I mispronounce anything, because the Nahuatl language is really beautiful but very complex, just let me know in the comments. Just correct me down there. I do want to be corrected because I wanted the most accurate pronunciation of everything attached to this video. So let's start with the introduction. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Aztecs built an empire that covered much of what is now central Mexico. The Aztecs are mainly remembered today for two things: their use of human sacrifice and the fact that their empire was overthrown by just a handful of Spanish soldiers in 1521. However, the Aztecs were a complex people. After settling in central Mexico, they built an empire through a combination of military strength and forming alliances with their neighbors. They were expert traders, with networks throughout Mexico and Central America. They built a mighty capital at Tenochtitlan. In the 14th century, Mexico was home to a range of peoples. They spoke the same languages and shared similar beliefs, gods, and rituals. The key to the Aztecs' rise to power was the formation in 1428 of the Triple Alliance between Tenochtitlan and its neighbors Texcoco and Tlacopan. The name Aztec can be used to describe the people of Tenochtitlan, but it is also used to describe the Triple Alliance. The peoples are sometimes also known as the Mexica. The name gives us the country name, Mexico. The empire ruled by the Triple Alliance reached its height early in the 16th century. The three central cities ruled conquered peoples who paid taxes to the empire's tribute, or donations in the form of goods or labor. It was this tribute that kept the empire wealthy. At the head of the empire was the emperor in Tenochtitlan. He led a large class of nobles who served as governors of the provinces of the empire, as priests and as warriors. Warfare was at the heart of Aztec life. It was both how the Aztecs conquered more land for the empire and how they captured victims for sacrifice. The Aztecs believed that sacrifice was essential to please the gods who protected them. Myths predicted that the Aztecs' world would end in violence and destruction. In 1519, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II heard that foreigners had landed on the Mexican coast. The newcomers were Spanish soldiers led by Hernan Cortés. They headed toward Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma made the Spaniards welcome, but other Aztecs soon began to worry that the foreigners were weakening the ruler's power. In June 1520, Aztec warriors drove the Spaniards out of Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma was killed in the fighting. The next year, Cortés gathered his troops and laid siege to the city. On August 13th, 1521, the capital surrendered. The Spaniards took charge and began to destroy all signs that the great Aztec Empire had ever existed. The roots of the empire. The origins of the Aztecs are shrouded in mystery. The Aztecs themselves told a story about the founding of their empire that combined legend and history. According to the story, the Aztecs came from a homeland called Aztlan, or place of the herons in Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Aztlan was said to be dry and full of cacti. Historians think it may have been in what is now northern Mexico or the southwestern United States. The Aztecs lived in Aztlan as hunter-gatherers. They spent most of their time there searching for food. The migration begins. There's a cat hair on my sleeve. There we go. In the early 1100s, 8 tribes left Aztlan to search for new land. This might have been because they were forced out by their enemies. According to Aztec legend, the tribes, known together as Chichimex, Chichimeca, I hope, wandered south. The god Huitzilopochtli, one more time, Huitzilopochtli, gave the tribes a new name, Mexica, from which the name Mexico comes. The tribe founded a settlement on Coatepetl, or Serpent Mountain, but Huitzilopochtli, I knew it was Huitzilopochtli, that's a typo, Huitzilopochtli told them to continue wandering. When the female warrior Coyolxauhqui refused, the god's followers killed her. The cult of Huitzilopochtli then became dominant among the Aztecs. Huitzilopochtli told them that they would be able to identify their new home. They would see an eagle perched on top of a prickly pear cactus eating a serpent. The Aztecs moved on. They visited the great ceremonial city of Tula, built by the Toltec. They also visited an abandoned Olmec city with 2 huge pyramids. The Aztecs named the place Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, the Valley of Mexico. After a century of wandering, the Aztecs came to the Valley of Mexico. They were the last of the 8 tribes to arrive, and the best land had been taken. The earlier arrivals had established city-states, including the Culhua, Acolhua, and the most powerful, the Tepanec. The Aztecs settled on a rocky hill in Culhua territory named Chapultepec, or Grasshopper Hill. The Culhua did not want it because the land was poor. For 40 years, the Aztecs grew crops there, but their stay ended when they were attacked by Copil, the son of the sister of Huitzilopochtli. In the battle that followed, the Aztecs killed Copil. It is said that Huitzilopochtli himself cut out Copil's heart and threw it into the marshy Lake Texcoco. The Culhua had grown nervous of the Aztecs and also attacked them. The Aztecs left Chapultepec and settled on Tizapan, which was covered in volcanic rocks and poisonous snakes. Despite this, the Aztecs remained there for the next 25 years, learning how to farm in the harsh conditions. Impressed that the Aztecs had succeeded in living in Tizapan, the Culhua king offered to form an alliance with them. The Aztecs agreed, realizing that an alliance would allow them to create the strongest army in the Valley of Mexico. The alliance soon ended. The Aztecs sacrificed the daughter of the king of Culhua to Huitzilopochtli. The furious king ordered his warriors to kill the Aztecs. The Aztecs fled to the swamps of Lake Texcoco. At the time, Lake Texcoco belonged to the Tepanec. The Tepanec allowed the Aztecs to live on an island in the middle of the swampy marsh. In return, the Aztecs had to pay tribute. Tribute was a kind of taxation paid in goods the Aztecs gave to the Tepanec. The Aztecs also had to supply warriors to fight the Tepanec's enemies. In the marsh of Texcoco, the prophecy of Huitzilopochtli finally came true. The Aztecs saw the eagle on top of the cactus, showing the spot where Copil's heart was buried. The Aztecs built a temple to Huitzilopochtli on the site and founded a city around it named Tenochtitlan. The year was 1325 CE. The Aztecs divided their new settlement into 4 quarters, each built around a ceremonial center with a temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. During the early period of settlement, the Aztecs quarreled among themselves. Some leaders broke away and moved to a nearby island lagoon, where they built a settlement called Tlatelolco. It would eventually grow to become a powerful rival of Tenochtitlan. Building the empire. Tenochtitlan grew into a large city on 2 islands in the middle of swampy Lake Texcoco. It was a remarkable feat of engineering and became a mighty capital for the Aztec Empire. The island city had stone temples, plazas, and eye-shaped courts for playing a sacred ball game. At the heart of the city was the royal complex. On its edges were homes made from adobe and farmland constructed with chinampas. Tenochtitlan was connected to the lake shore by a series of raised causeways that made the city easy to defend. About 50 years after founding the city, the Aztecs chose their first king, or Tlatoani, or he who speaks. He was a Kamapichtli, and he was a Kulhua nobleman. The new king built the Aztecs' power by marrying the daughters of local leaders to earn their loyalty. Despite a Kamapichtli strategy, the Aztecs still had to pay tribute to the more powerful Tepanec by giving them goods such as food. The Aztec warriors still served in the Tepanec army. In exchange, the Tepanec protected Tenochtitlan and traded with Aztec merchants. After a Kamapichtli's death in 1395, his son Huitzilopochtli became Tlatoani. He married the daughter of the Tepanec ruler Tezozomoc, partly in order to reduce the amount of tribute the Aztecs paid. Huitzilopochtli also helped turn the Aztecs into even better warriors. Aztec kings. After Huitzilopochtli's death in 1417, the Tepanec ruler Tezozomoc seized the Aztec throne. On Tezozomoc's death in 1426, his son Maxtla killed all the Aztec rivals for the throne and seized it for himself. The Aztecs are too weak to take on the Tepanec to stop him. In 1427, the Aztecs chose as Tlatoani one of a Kamapichtli's sons, Itzcoatl, helped by his nephew Tlacalo. Itzcoatl formed alliances against Maxtla and the Tepanec. Itzcoatl formed the Triple Alliance in 1428 with Texcoco and Tlacopan against the Tepanec. The Tepanec army had a fearsome reputation, but the Aztecs and their allies attacked them head-on rather than surrounding them, as was a more common military tactic at the time. The Tepanec fled, and the Aztecs destroyed the Tepanec city of Azcapotzalco to ruins. This was also unusual at the time. Victory of the Triple Alliance. The Triple Alliance divided Tepanec territory, but although the Tepanec were weakened, they were not destroyed. A city named Coyoacan resisted until Aztec warriors destroyed it, and finally defeated the last Tepanec warriors in battle. The Triple Alliance was now in firm control of the Valley of Mexico. It set about building its power. It conquered city-states in what are now central and southern Mexico, and it divided its new territory into provinces. The provinces had to pay tribute to the Triple Alliance. This helped keep them under control. The height of the empire. In 1440, Huitzilopochtli's son Moctezuma became the new Tlatoani. The new ruler planned to expand the empire to stretch from the Pacific Ocean in the west to the Gulf of Mexico in the east. The empire had become rich thanks to tribute from the conquered tribes. Moctezuma used this wealth to improve Tenochtitlan with new temples, homes, and roads. He made sure that his warriors were richly rewarded and that his people were fed and had work. He also built alliances with tribes conquered by his predecessors. He believed that the way to achieve his expansion plan was to keep the gods happy. He sent wise men north to find Aztlan, the place where legend said their ancestors had originated. The wise men retraced the ancient journey. On the way, they heard a prophecy that Huitzilopochtli and the Aztecs would lose their power. The prophecies of disaster. Moctezuma was unhappy to hear about the prophecy. Everything seemed to be going well. However, soon afterward, several natural disasters seemed to be bad omens. A plague of locusts descended on the Valley of Mexico. They ate all the crops, so the Aztecs had to eat the grain they had stored in the royal granaries. Moctezuma ordered human sacrifices to keep the gods happy. Then in 1449, Tenochtitlan flooded as heavy rains caused the waters of Lake Texcoco to rise. The next year, a frost that killed the crops was followed by a drought. Hey, rooster. With the royal granaries empty, 1 million people began to starve. The Aztecs believed the only way to halt the catastrophes was to please gods with human blood. A sacrifice had formerly consisted of a few animals. Now hundreds of people were sacrificed. Fortunes changed in 1454 when the two Aztec calendars both began on the same day. The event was celebrated with the new fire ceremony. Moctezuma began to build a bigger stone temple to honor Huitzilopochtli. The Aztec captured the city-state of Chalco, a rich source of stone 20 miles away from Tenochtitlan. The Chalco prisoners they seized were sacrificed. After Moctezuma died in 1468, the Aztec elders wanted his advisor Tlacaelel to become the new king. Tlacaelel refused, preferring to be the power behind the throne for Moctezuma's young son Axayacatl. Axayacatl set out to expand the empire. After his army put down a rebellion in the neighboring city of Tlatelolco, Axayacatl turned to the Tarascans, the Aztecs' main rivals in the west. In 1478, the Tarascans easily defeated the Aztec in Tzintzuntzan, the main Tarascan city. Of the 40,000 Aztec warriors who set out, only 2,000 returned to Tenochtitlan. This is an awesome name. I hope I said it right. It's fun to say. Despite its heavy defeat, Axayacatl's position was strengthened when the king of Texcoco, Nezahualcoyotl, died in 1472 without an heir. Because Texcoco was a member of the Triple Alliance, Axayacatl was able to claim the empty throne, increasing Aztec power. When Axayacatl died in 1481, his brother Tizoc took over. He was a weak king whose short rule achieved very little. There was great relief when his brother Ahuitzotl came to the throne in 1486. The height of Aztec power. A fine military strategist, Ahuitzotl finally took control of areas that had resisted Aztec domination to the south and west of Tenochtitlan in 1491 and 1495. The newly defeated regions paid tribute that included cacao beans used to make chocolate, which the Aztecs highly prized. By 1495, the empire of the Triple Alliance was so large it was becoming increasingly hard to manage. In Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, rulers wanted ever more magnificent temples and palaces and fine clothes and jewelry. The burden of tribute on the subjugated peoples grew. When Moctezuma II became Tlatoani in 1502, the empire was at breaking point. Moctezuma had firm ideas about the empire. Life in the Triple Alliance seemed to be stable, but its stability was about to be tested. There we go. The peoples of the empire. The empire of the Triple Alliance was built on military conquest and the defeat of other city-states, whose peoples were forced to join the growing empire. The Triple Alliance of the Tlacopan, Aztecs, and Texcoco began as a defensive alliance against military attack by the Tepanec. As the empire grew dependent on tribute from defeated enemies, however, it tried to win more victories to ensure it received more tribute. The wealthier the empire grew, the more wealth it wanted. By 1502, the empire was so big it was divided into districts. Each district had its own schedule of tribute payments. The tribute goods varied from quetzal feathers to stone. They were traded in Tenochtitlan's markets or sent to the royal palaces. Resentment of the tribute system led many of the Aztecs' neighbors to cooperate with the Spaniards when the European invaders arrived in 1519. Different Aztec rulers fought different enemies. Itzcoatl conquered most of the empire of the Tepanec, who had once controlled the Aztecs and forced them to pay tribute. Itzcoatl defeated the Tepanec in battle in 1428. The Tarascans. Not positive, but I'll go with Tarascans. Is that what I've been saying? I hope. The Tarascans were the Aztecs' main rivals in the west, where they lived around Lake Pátzcuaro. Like the Aztecs, they were a warring people who expanded their territory by conquering their neighbors. They controlled areas that produced goods the Aztecs valued, such as honey, feathers, cotton, salt, gold, and copper. Xiacatl wanted to gain access to these resources. He sent ambassadors to tell the Tarascans to accept Aztec rule, but the Tarascans ignored them. Their well-trained warriors carried better weapons than the Aztecs. They were copper rather than stone, like Aztec weapons. In the battle that followed, the Aztecs were defeated. The Tarascan Empire survived until the arrival of the Spaniards in 1519. Totonac resistance. The Totonac lived in eastern Mexico. Although the Aztecs made a series of attempts to conquer them, they were not able to bring them completely under control. Rebellions against the Triple Alliance broke out regularly, and the Totonac would play a large part in the downfall of the Aztecs by siding with the Spanish explorer Hernán Cortés in 1519, helping Cortés. The Tlaxcala also helped Cortés. Living in central Mexico east of the Popocatépetl volcano, the Tlaxcala constantly warred with the Aztecs, but were never conquered. When the Spaniards arrived, the Tlaxcala, eager for revenge on the Aztecs, allied themselves with the Europeans. They supplied most of the men who fought under the Spanish flag against the Aztecs. In return, the Tlaxcala were granted special status by the Spaniards in the new colony, and paid no tribute to the European rulers, unlike most of the other native peoples. Life in the Empire. Aztec life was highly organized. Everyone in the empire had a specific task, even the emperor. The state protected and fed the people and shaped all aspects of their lives. The Aztecs had a rigid social structure with three classes: nobles, commoners, and slaves. People were born into their class and had little opportunity to move out of it. At the head of the nobility, or Pipiltin, was the king, or Tlatoani, the undisputed head of the empire. To gain closer access to the emperor, other nobles had to marry well, serve the empire, or enjoy military success. Noble status was hereditary, but although nobles enjoyed a privileged position, they ate better food and lived in more substantial and comfortable houses. They were still expected to work. Many worked as government officials, judges, or military leaders. Noble women worked in the home. Each city-state in the empire had its own Tlatoani, who, as well as being king, was also the commander-in-chief of the army and the high priest. He came from the Aztec royal family, which was very large because each king was allowed to have up to 100 wives. The most important Tlatoani was the ruler of Tenochtitlan. All the others had to obey him. Once elected, a Tlatoani served for life. Warfare and warriors. War was at the heart of Aztec life. It was the means by which the empire expanded, and it was also the most important way of acquiring the large number of victims needed for human sacrifice. Training to be a warrior started in boyhood. There we go. By the age of 17, every healthy male was trained to use weapons and was expected to fight if called upon. Warriors earned the respect of the Aztec people, and their special status was reflected in the uniforms they wore. The greater the military ability of a warrior, the more spectacular his uniform. The two most respected groups of warriors were the Jaguar Knights and the Eagle Knights, who wore special helmets and carried special shields that depicted their animal. An Aztec warrior had several kinds of weapon. They included spears, slings, bows and arrows, spear throwers, knives, and swords. The blades were made from obsidian, a type of hard glass-like stone. The army was divided into small groups of about 200 men, who combined into larger battalions up to 8,000 men. Some 2,000 200,000 warriors would take part in a major military campaign. Gods and sacrifice. Aztec life was structured around the worship of hundreds of gods and goddesses. The Aztecs inherited many of these from cultures they had conquered, such as the Toltec god Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs believed the gods were involved in every aspect of daily life. When bad things happened, they believed the gods were punishing them. They also thought that hostile natural phenomena, such as lightning or drought, were caused when the gods are angry. The Aztec gods. Huitzilopochtli, the chief god of war, the son who had also led the Aztecs to Mexico from Aztlan, was one of the three major Aztec gods. Tezcatlipoca was another war god, but was also associated with the night sky, kingship, and magic. The third god, Quetzalcoatl, was god of civilization, priests, and learning. Aztec myths told stories about the rivalry between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl. It was said that Tezcatlipoca had tricked Quetzalcoatl when he was ruler of Tula and forced him to leave the Toltec city. Food and drink. The staples of the Aztecs were foods that are still eaten today: corn, beans, squash, avocados, tomatoes, and peppers. The staple dish was the tortilla made from corn or maize. Girls learned at an early age how to prepare tortillas. Only wealthier nobles could afford to eat meat. Dogs and turkeys were raised for meat, and hunters killed deer, rabbit, ducks, and geese. There were no sheep, pigs, or cattle until they were introduced by the Spaniards in the 1500s. Popular treats for the Tlatoani and other nobles were roasted worms and grasshoppers. Octli was a popular drink made from the agave plant. The agave sap was boiled and fermented until it turned into a smooth alcoholic drink. Strict rules were meant to stop people drinking too much octli, but these rules are often ignored. Only the richest households could afford to drink hot chocolate made from cacao beans, which were a highly sought-after form of tribute. The ground beans were blended with water and chili peppers to make it spicy rather than a sweet drink. Trade. Alongside warfare, one of the other distinctive features of life in the Aztec Empire was the extensive trade network that linked it to other peoples, often over considerable distances. In recognition of the importance of trade, merchants were highly respected. They played a vital role in the expansion of the empire. They were the ones who traveled to its farthest corners to acquire luxury goods such as quetzal feathers, dyes, cloth, turquoise, obsidian, and slaves. The most valuable goods went straight into the treasuries of the king. The merchants also acted as spies known as pochteka, gathering information about the peoples of the empire. Jewelry and clothing. As the empire expanded, the Tlatoani grew used to the magnificent goods that were constantly brought back to Tenochtitlan. Gold and silver were used to make fine jewelry for the nobility. The brilliant green feathers of the quetzal bird were only permitted to be worn by the Tlatoani and the highest-ranking nobles. There were strict rules about what color of clothing a person could wear, depending on his or her position in society. Only the Tlatoani could wear teal or turquoise, while priests wore black or dark green. Fall of the Empire. In February 1519, the Spaniard Hernan Cortés landed with 500 men on the island of Cozumel off the Yucatan Peninsula. In just over 2 years, he destroyed the mighty Aztec Empire. At home in Spain, Cortés heard the rumors about the riches of the New World and wanted to see them for himself. He sailed to Cuba, where the governor, Diego Velázquez, forbade him to go to Mexico. Cortés sailed for Mexico anyway. On Cozumel, Cortés soon learned of a Spaniard who lived nearby. Jerónimo de Aguilar had been shipwrecked 8 years earlier. Cortés hired Aguilar as a translator. This was because Aguilar spoke Mayan. Cortés also used a local slave, Doña Marina, as a translator because she spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl. In Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma II soon learned of the arrival of the bearded white men. He sent a delegation to meet them with gifts of turquoise, feathers, and gold. The Spaniards showed little interest in these semi-precious stones or feathers, but were impressed by the gold. Cortés put on a show for the Aztecs. In full armor and on horseback, the Spaniards waved their swords as Cortés fired his cannon. The Aztecs were terrified because they had never seen either horses or gunpowder. They were also confused because it did not appear that the Spaniards wanted to be friendly. Greeting Moctezuma. When Moctezuma heard about this first meeting with the Spaniards, he sent another group to meet them. These warriors and priests took with them captives to sacrifice when they arrived. This horrified the Spaniards. Cortés had learned from the Totonac, enemies of the Aztecs, about Tenochtitlan and its fabulous wealth. He was eager to see it for himself. When some of his men wanted to return to Cuba, Cortés had after all disobeyed Governor Velázquez. Cortés burned his own ships. His men had no choice. They started the 200-mile march inland to Tenochtitlan. On the way, the Spaniards defeated the Otomi and the Potonchans, and made an alliance with the Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcala then tricked their enemies, the Cholula, into believing they and the Spaniards came in peace. With their guard down, they were easily defeated. When the Aztecs heard about the defeat of the Cholula, they assumed the Spaniards must have a powerful army. The Spaniards arrived in Tenochtitlan, where Moctezuma showered them with gifts, including more gold. He intended the gifts to show how powerful the Aztec Empire was. The Spaniards did not understand the message, however. Seeing the gold, they became greedy for more. Like other Europeans, they prized gold for its monetary value, but the Aztecs appreciated it more for its capacity to be made into beautiful objects. An astonishing city. When the Spaniards reached Tenochtitlan, they were astounded. Compared with towns in Spain, it was advanced and clean. However, despite the sophistication of the city, the Europeans saw human sacrifice as a sign that the Aztecs were barbarians. Moctezuma II invited Cortés and his men to stay in his palace. The Spaniards gradually turned him into a puppet ruler by influencing all his decisions. They took all the gold he had in his palace. Seeing that the king's powers were being undermined, the Aztec elders deposed Moctezuma and appointed his brother Cuitlahuac in his place. At the time, Cortés was in an uncomfortable position. Governor Velázquez had sent men to arrest him for disobeying orders. Leaving Pedro de Alvarado in charge of Tenochtitlan, Cortés set out to turn back Velázquez's men. While he was gone, Alvarado ordered his men to attack the Aztec. It was a dreadful mistake. The Aztecs fought back, and when Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan, he realized that the Spanish had to leave the city to avoid being attacked. As they tried to slip away at night, on July 1st, 1520, the Aztecs stopped them. In the clash that followed, 2/3 of the Spaniards were killed along with 1,000 Tlaxcala warriors. The final battle. For now, the Aztecs were victorious, but having glimpsed the wealth of the empire, Cortés would not give it up easily. He waited for Spanish reinforcements to arrive from Cuba. Just as the Aztecs started to believe the threat from the Spaniards had disappeared, another terrible blow hit them. In September 1520, smallpox killed thousands of Aztecs. The Spaniards had unknowingly brought the germs that caused the disease with them. With no immunity to it, the Aztecs had no resistance. Cuitlahuac died as well, possibly as one of the disease's victims. Cortés continued his plan to plan his revenge on the In December 1520, Cortes and his allies marched on the Aztecs' capital. There they built ships to use to besiege the city. On May 30th, 1521, the Spaniards launched the ships on Lake Texcoco. They prevented the Aztecs from transporting supplies. The siege lasted for 80 days. During this time, Cortes and his men gradually fought their way to the center of Tenochtitlan. They captured the last Tlatoani, Cuauhtémoc, and by August 13th, 1521, Tenochtitlan had fallen to the Spaniards. The Spanish Empire. The Spaniards took over the empire. They allowed the Aztecs to choose their own leaders, but Spaniards were in charge. They pulled down the temples and set about converting the Aztecs to Catholicism. The gold Cortes wanted so badly was sent back to Spain. It would be 300 years before the descendants of the Aztecs got rid of their colonial rulers. Oh, that's the end of our book. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good night. Good night.